then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? The 12 asked him. Perhaps they thought it was an innocent question, born out of simple curiosity. Jesus had talked so much about the kingdom of God already, and they knew they could ask him what they wanted. But sometimes our questions reveal the truth about where our hearts are. I actually think this one did. Perhaps they were struggling. The disciples were struggling perhaps with comparison. There were 12 after all, and 3 of them had just been taken up on a special trip to the top of a mountain. And when Peter, James, and John had returned, they refused to say anything about what had just happened. But the other 9 weren't dumb. They knew by the looks on their faces it had been remarkable, whatever it was. And maybe questions just started bubbling inside of them. Then Jesus talked again about how he was going to die, and all of them were probably just confused. Jesus was full of ideas about what this kingdom was going to look like, but when it came down to it, the disciples had no idea how that would play out. Now, they were limited not just by the parables that Jesus had told, but they were also limited by these 2 blueprints that had been stamped in them of what a kingdom was actually like. On the one hand, they had ideas based on the fact that they were raised in Jewish culture. The kingdom of David was God's kingdom, but it had a hierarchy. I mean, David may have been loved by God because of his humility, but let's be honest. David was loved by his people because God gave him success. And then on the other side, they had Roman, dog eat dog, fight for your rights, Jews come last kingdom that also had a hierarchy, one that changed frequently and that was constantly oppressing people. And those were their 2 frameworks. So when Jesus, he talked metaphorically, even poetically, about what the kingdom of God was like, there was very little the disciples could practically compare it to. Kingdoms they knew had hierarchies. And if we're honest, we're no different. All of our kingdoms have hierarchies too. Survival of the fittest. The one who works the smartest gets the reward. The one who acts the best and who keeps their composure the longest wins. The one who climbs fastest makes it to the top. The one who dies with the most things or accomplishment or power actually wins. You see, our kingdoms have hierarchies too. Who was Jesus' right-hand man going to be? Who was going to get the biggest honor or the most jewels in their crown, so to speak? The question that the disciples asked Jesus, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, actually revealed exactly where their hearts were. And I think they should have asked what was really going on in their heads, which was, how can I be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? If you have your Bible, open with me to Matthew chapter 18. We're going to start reading at verse 2. Jesus called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Jesus sees through the question the disciples were asking and surprises them in 2 different ways with his answer. First, he says, unless you change, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, that would have made all of the disciples kind of stand at attention because, wait a second, I thought we were already in. What do you mean I have to change in order to enter it? We were inside just a minute ago. What are you doing, kicking us out again? In some sense, Jesus is saying, stop worrying about being the greatest. Can you even fit through the door? Other translations use the word convert instead of change, but the literal translation of the Greek is actually turn around. It's like Jesus is saying, you want to be the greatest? You're not even headed toward the kingdom with that question. But the second surprise, which is probably the most significant, is it would have been expected for a rabbi to answer a question like that with a list of requirements, things to ensure personal holiness. Like, okay, so you want to be the greatest. Well, you have to do good works. You have to keep all of the law, even like the finest minutia of the law. You have to know and you have to meditate on the Holy Scriptures. You got to tithe. Jesus' disciples might have even expected him to throw in a couple extra things like, oh, you got to be able to perform miracles. But Jesus responds with absolutely no list. He calls a child to himself and he says, whoever becomes like a little child. Now, before you think of this as like some sweet cherub kind of moment where a kid's sitting on the knee of Jesus, I need to frame this for the scandalous nature of it all. Because children were actually the bottom rung of society in Jesus' day. Now, today we're kind of determined to like psychologically nurture the identity of our kids. But back then, kids were commonly referred to as it until after puberty. We don't even call our dogs it anymore. Children were expected to die young because child mortality rate was so high. They couldn't contribute to society or their households. They were drains. Some scholars actually believe that this is the only time in ancient Jewish literature that children are used as a positive example. Some even think it's the only time in all of ancient literature that children are used as a positive example. Particularly girls who eventually would cost their families a dowry when they were married off were the real drains. One of my favorite scholars, N.T. Wright, actually thinks that for that reason, the child that Jesus calls to himself was probably female. It just augments the point of the moment. Jesus sets the standard for heaven as the lowest of all status. Whoever becomes like a little child, he tells his disciples. I was in the airport a few weeks ago waiting for a flight, and across the breezeway, I was watching this family try to make it to their gate. And I watched for probably 10 minutes, which was probably kind of creepy, but I couldn't help it, okay? And it was a mother, a father, and 4 kids, and they were probably all under the age of 6. I watched for 10 minutes, and they probably went 4 yards. It was unbelievable, okay? Now, each one of the little kids one of them would like start dancing, and then one of them would be like, hey, my sister's dancing, so I'm gonna start dancing too. And then the mom would like try to grab one of them, and then try to, grab the other one. And then the little boy literally just dropped his backpack and kept walking, and the dad's like, nope, can't do that, gotta walk back, grab the backpack. So this was like going on for quite some time. The little kid in the stroller was screaming because he was like, I don't wanna be in here, I wanna be like my siblings. And basically, it was like back and forth and back and forth. And I watched and just was like in awe of the whole thing. Now, the parents were a little bit more irritated than I probably than I was just watching. But it was really interesting watching these kids absentmindedly twirl and be curious and bounce around, all while they were being herded by their parents. And on the one hand, they were acting childish because there was a task at hand, get to gate 16A for Delta flight so-and-so, and they were not performing, okay? There was no performance going on. And childish is not what Jesus is asking his disciples to be. But childlike, unbeknownst to them, these kids were humbly dependent. Their survival was literally held together by the way that their parents guided them, in the way that they were trusting their parents. When Jesus is telling his disciples to be a child, he's saying, check your pride. You are humbly dependent in God's kingdom. And with that, the hierarchy that the disciples were trying to fill in with their own names was completely obliterated. The goal had changed from greatness to the acceptance of childlike dependence. What had been complicated by their desire for to-dos and assurance and status was completely simplified because Jesus just wants humility. But there's a directive at the end of this that follows becoming like a child. Jesus says to welcome little children. In his book, What is Christianity?, Adolf von Harnack wrote, humility is not a virtue by itself. It is the opening up of the heart to God. This, then, is the source and origin of the love of one's neighbor. Humility is the linchpin to a right relationship with God, but it is also the very beginning of our right relationship with others. And Jesus, in his discourse, now moves from telling his disciples, hey, I really want you to be humble, to telling them, hey, I want you to welcome the humble, the little ones, who we come to find out are all followers of Jesus. The word for welcome in this verse actually means to take the hand of. Whoever takes the hand of a little child is taking the hand of Jesus. I can't help but get this double image. As you reach down to take the hand of a dependent, trusting, bright-eyed child, you are declaring the fact that the hands that you put your trust in are big enough to hold both of you. And as you learn to trust the hands of your Heavenly Father, it becomes second nature to take the hands of other people because they need to remember their dependence on Him too. But Jesus doesn't just stop there. He continues and He explains how we care for these little ones. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to stumble. Such things must come, but woe to the person through whom they come. The first way that we guard and care for these little ones is we humbly guard our innocence because little ones are watching. Have you ever seen a toddler that's learning how to walk, try to move around? Okay, they're basically tiny drunk adults. They just kind of topple around. And most of the time when they fall, someone is there to pick them back up again and set them on their feet so that they could try again. Well, what if I told you I was a toddler pusher? I was the one that put out a finger or gave a little push to them while they were running, or maybe set up kind of an obstacle course so I knew if they were going to be cruising in a certain direction, there was no way they weren't going to hit one of them, okay? Besides the fact that that would make me an absolutely miserable human being, there is a 100% chance I would win the balance battle. There's a 100% chance I can topple a toddler. Why? Because their balance is vulnerable. Their balance is completely vulnerable. Jesus here is pointing out the obvious. Temptation or stumbling blocks or things that cause people to stumble will come. Toddlers are gonna fall, but if you're the one that pushes the toddler over, you have another thing coming. Jesus uses really intense language here. I don't know if you noticed. It would be better for you to have a millstone wrapped around your neck and to be sunk to the bottom of the sea than what will actually happen to you if you cause someone to stumble. That's really intense language. Jesus, I don't think, would be this extreme in his language if the threat of misleading other followers of Jesus wasn't real. Now, as somebody who's literally in front of people telling people about Jesus, this terrifies me. It absolutely terrifies me. And I've thought all week long the answer to this question. If somebody were to open my life up and look at all of it, would all of it cause them to glorify God, or would I be distracting? Would my actions be distracting? Maybe you're thinking, man, I'm a mom and I have kids whose faith I can destroy by the way that I act and I behave. No pressure. Or maybe, you're thinking, I'm the only Christian at my workplace. No one else knows Jesus, but I have bad days sometimes, okay? Maybe you're feeling this weight, this immediate weight and wave of pressure. But Jesus, he immediately gives us an antidote to creating stumbling blocks for people. I'm going to pick up in verse 7. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. There's the antidote. It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into the fire of hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into the fire of hell. Antidote. The best way to guard your faith for other believers is guard your own innocence. Guard your own innocence. Jesus says we're to discard parts of us that cause us to sin. Cut off your hand, gouge out your eye. Interestingly, this is the second time in the book of Matthew Jesus has said almost exactly the same thing. The first time was in the Sermon on the Mount when he's talking about lust and adultery. And it's interesting, he doesn't just say, hey, if you're lusting, stop doing it. If you're sinning, just stop. He actually takes a step back and goes to a source that is morally neutral. Hands and eyes are morally neutral. They're not innately sinful. And I think because of the hyperbolic language here, we have this tendency to just kind of gloss over what Jesus is saying. Be willing to cut stuff out of your life. Oh, good, Jesus. But really what he's saying is be willing to cut out of your life even things that are morally neutral in order to guard your innocence. The internet, morally neutral. But you can do a whole lot of evil with the internet. What would it look like to cut out what needs to be cut out to avoid the things that tempt you away from Jesus? Food? Alcohol, exercise, money, movies, music, social media, morally neutral. But if food is your coping mechanism when no one is looking, or social media puts you in a rabbit hole of comparison, or you cling to your money out of a desire for control, what step do you need to do to take to divorce yourself from the source of your temptation? It's better for you to enter life maimed than to be thrown into the fire of hell. The discomfort you may feel by cutting something out of your life may inconvenience you, but Jesus is basically saying our purity of heart is no joke. It's no joke to him. And if you're feeling the weight of conviction like I have been this week, God has comforted me a ton as I prayed through this. First, he reminded me, hey, I knew what you were going to struggle with when I chose you. I knew every single one of your sins, every single time you were going to stumble away from me when I chose you, and I still chose you. That was the first way that he comforted me. But then he also has been teaching me a lot about innocence. Now, in the Western church, we learn about a lot of virtues like innocence and purity and wisdom. And for some reason, we get it into our heads that they're kind of like treasures, and treasures that we like get somehow, and we're supposed to cling to them. But then if we lose them, well, we've lost it, and our innocence is gone, our purity's gone. But do you realize we were not born virtuous? We were born sinners. So we were born without virtue. Naivety, thankfully, we do lose that as we grow up. But innocence, purity, wisdom, virtues are cultivated in our life intentionally as we realize and admit how broken we are and how much we need them. They're grown in us as we choose to honor God instead of ourselves. They're grown in us as we choose humility. And you know what? They can also be crushed if we don't choose humility. Humbly guard your innocence like your life depends on it, because little ones are watching and they can stumble. But the second way we care for little ones or followers of Jesus is we humbly love the wanderer, because little ones matter to God. I'm going to pick up in verse 10. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he is happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish. Now, in the beginning of this section, the word despise is kind of an interesting translation, and I have a really hard time with it. It kind of gets lost on me because when I think of things that I despise, I think baby carrots and cherry medicine and horror movies and making more than one trip to the car to grab my bags out of the car. Can't stand it, okay? Those are the words that I would use. Those are the things that I would use the word despise to talk about. I don't use the word despise when I'm talking about people. So when Jesus says, don't despise one of these little ones, I can easily think, okay, well, that's easy. Check that one off the list. And then, that's the end of my conviction. But another way to translate the Greek word here is to think less of. Do not think less of even one of these little ones. Okay, conviction is back. We live in a place that's marked by people thinking highly of themselves. Everybody thinks highly of themselves. We love achievement, and we love talking about our achievement. We love talking about how tired we are because we've achieved so much. We love being busy. We love talking about how tired we are because we're so busy, okay? And it's very easy in our envy or in our hubris to look at other people and think they are less important than we are. Or if they're more important than we are, we think they're more important than we are, we look down on them because of our envy. Now, oftentimes, because of that, we kind of distance ourselves from people because we think it's going to take too much energy for them to be incorporated into our lives. Turns out, it's easier to despise these little ones than I thought. But I love the evidence of the importance of each of God's children here, because Jesus says each little one has an angel looking at the face of God constantly. Now, this passage isn't about guardian angels, and I think that that's the first thing people are like, oh my gosh, everybody's got a guardian angel. This is so cool. That's actually not what the passage is about at all. This passage is alluding to an Old Testament passage in Isaiah. It's a throne room scene. And in this throne room where God is, there are these heavenly beings. And God's holiness was so intense for them that they had a pair of wings specifically to cover their eyes and shield them from his holiness. That's how amazing God is. But these little ones, they have angels that can look directly on the face of God because they are that important to him. They're that important to him. Don't despise these little ones because these little ones are indescribably valuable to God. What if we started looking at people like that? That person who irritates you or who you can't stand being around or who you're tempted to think less of. That person has an angel in heaven staring in wonder at the face of God. And because God values that person so deeply, you should too. It changes things. Now, Jesus then moves into this metaphor that's pretty familiar to a lot of us. And he talks about how it's like a shepherd that leaves his 99 sheep to go pursue the one that wanders off. Now, I've always read this passage and thought, wow, how unusually compassionate of that shepherd. He leaves the 99 for the one. That's awesome. But that's actually not the tone that Jesus has here. He's a little snarky right here. He's saying, will he not leave the 99 in pursuit of the one? In other words, duh, that's what shepherds do. Shepherds don't lose their sheep. They just don't. They'd be out of business if they lost their sheep. They don't let their sheep disappear. That's just the way it is. And if that's the case for a shepherd, how much more so is it the case for God, who's going to pursue the one who's infinitely valuable to him? God's kind of a perfectionist. 99 is not going to cut it. He's going to chase after that one because that one is individually and uniquely made by his hands. And if you're here this morning and you're thinking, you know what? I don't even know if I care about God anymore. Too bad. He cares about you. And if you're thinking, you know what, like this church thing, I'm like really apathetic about it and like my faith just feels really dead. Well, guess what? You might be that one and God will not give up on you. He's not going to give up on you. I dare you to ask him to come after you because he will. He doesn't fail. In fact, in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep. And if he knows the intimate details of your life, your thought patterns, your mess, your triumphs, and all the things that you hate that you think about, if he knows all of that, and he still not only pursues you, but tells everybody else, hey, don't mess with him because he's mine, how valuable must you be to him? You see, little ones matter to God. Humbly love the wanderer. Now, I'm just going to interject something here because it's kind of been the elephant in the room that I've been thinking about the past couple weeks, because this passage is all about children. And there have been children taken from their parents and put in detention centers along our borders. And it is shocking and pitiful evidence of the fallenness of humanity. But if your first thought when I brought this up is which president or which law is to blame, or whether or not those kids came into this country legally, you are missing the point of this passage completely. Because God's little ones are valuable, and who is to blame is of very little consequence to him. Very little consequence. You know what is of consequence to him? The vulnerable, valuable, and teachable hearts of each and every one of those kids. In this situation right now, I have no idea how to tangibly move my hands to make anything different. But I do know that we serve a God who sees each and every one of them and knows them intimately. And I do know that they have an angel looking directly at the face of God, staring at his face. Church, even when our heads are confused, when we hear messages about laws and blame, let's be people who put our hearts on the line in prayer for people on the margins. Because God is just, always. And he pursues the little one that the world forgets. Little ones matter to God. Humbly love the wanderer. The last way that Jesus explains we are to welcome these little ones is to humbly correct them, because we're all learning. I'm going to pick up in verse 15. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them. Now, this is the church discipline passage that everybody quotes all the time. Jesus gives really specific steps about how to deal with your brothers and sisters or other believers who are doing things that are wrong or you see might be leading them away from God. First, address people one-on-one. Address the behavior one-on-one. Tell them the truth in the hopes that their behavior changes. If that doesn't work, try to take a couple more people with you to tell them the truth again, hoping that maybe more people will make them more inclined to change their behavior. But then if that doesn't work, bring it to the church and tell the church in hopes that they'll listen to the church's talk. But if they don't listen to the church, for the sake of the holiness of the church as a whole, treat them as a non-believer. That's kind of the wrap-up of the whole thing. Now, it'd be really easy to spend a whole sermon just on this passage or a whole sermon series on church discipline, especially because we oftentimes have really, really, really negative experiences and negative thoughts about discipline as a whole. Now, in our Western mindsets, often discipline and grace are completely incompatible. We think like, no, not discipline. Grace, all grace. You do you, okay? You do you. Well, Jesus, who is the definition of grace, doesn't agree with that. Grace actually cannot exist without discipline. And before we tense up about this, I want to extract a few principles from that explain the importance of the practice of discipline, but also the importance of our heart posture in the middle of it. So, first, why is discipline important? First, we point out areas of need in each other and receive the correction of others because we're valuable to God. That's first. If our lives didn't matter to God, we wouldn't have to worry about correcting our behavior. We could all live however we wanted. But just like a little child needs a parent to tell them to not only eat what just tastes good or to stay away from danger, we need each other to point out areas in our lives that are misleading us. And we do that because we value each other. But second, we point out areas of need because forgiveness and reconciliation actually produce joy. When someone erases your debts, it's really kind of a joyful experience. So imagine for a second that someone either paid your rent for a year or paid off your mortgage entirely. Okay? Now, if somebody did that, there'd be no ounce of you who'd think, man, I can't believe I ever had a mortgage. Or man, I can't believe I ever had to pay rent. You wouldn't dwell on that. You'd be just super excited about the fact that you didn't have to pay it anymore because someone did it for you, right? Yeah. Now, the purpose of correcting other believers is so that they can have a chance to experience their debts being washed away by the cleansing of Christ's grace. And even more so than having monetary debt washed away, experiencing the washing away of shame is even more joyful. Always more joyful. So the reason that we correct each other is so that we each can experience forgiveness and joy. Third, we correct each other because Jesus commands us to. That's it, because he commands us to. Now, some of you are in here thinking, you know what? This is where the whole church gets everything wrong. Okay, they all go correcting each other willy-nilly, telling each other how to live each other's lives, and they get all up in each other's business. Suspend your judgment just for a minute. Or if you're thinking, wow, I have about 50 people that I get to correct right when I leave this auditorium, okay? You especially suspend your judgment, okay? Because why we correct is important, but it is equally, if not more important, how we correct. And how do we do that? First, we do it incrementally. So you start one-on-one. I think that's probably one of the most important things that Jesus said here. You start one-on-one. Why? Because your goal is always to love the person well and never to shame them. Never. And here again, we see why without humility and without us checking ourselves before we go into situations like this, we're going to miss this entirely. And if you go on correcting people without humility without the humility that produces love, no joy, only pain will come through your correction every single time. So first, we do it incrementally. Second, we correct people directly. You know what kills churches faster than almost anything else? Gossip. Yeah, gossip kills churches. Telling someone to tell somebody else something that you don't really want to talk to them about because you're afraid of conflict and you're just not a conflict type of person. Do you know that's not holy correction. That's unholy gossip. I heard a pastor say on the radio one time, if you're not part of the problem and you're not part of the solution, you shouldn't be talking about it. I feel like that's pretty good. That's a pretty good litmus test to figure out whether or not we're supposed to be involved in things. So second, we correct each other directly. But third, we do it gracefully. All discipline or accountability or calling out or whatever else you want to call it should be done in the hopes of people being drawn into deeper relationship with Jesus. We deal with sin in each other head on because we want people to deal with our sin head on too. Because we know we're going to be the one that makes a mistake at some point. We're going to be the toddler that falls. Because we will make mistakes that need correcting. And if you think that you won't be the one that needs correcting ever, you need to become a child. Fourth, though, we do it confidently. Jesus knew that people, when they get corrected, don't often respond well. They don't often respond initially with like, oh my gosh, I feel so joyful because you just corrected me. This is so wonderful. Most of the time, the look in their eyes is more like, who do you think you are, God? Okay? And that's why Jesus includes this little addendum at the end of the passage. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Where two or more are gathered, there I will be. If you have checked yourself and prayed and included the right people, not just the people you want involved, but the right people, you can stand in confident knowledge that God is standing with you. You're not God, but he might be using you to call one of his little ones back into the fold. Little ones are learning. We're all learning. We all need humble correction. So, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? How do you sum all of this up? It's pretty simple. Become a child, welcome God's children. That's it. It's that simple and it's that difficult, all at the same time. The disciples didn't know then that the pride that they were showing in asking the question was pride that Jesus was going to die for. Also that they could be his children too. That's kind of the beauty in all of this. The one who calls us to be dependent on him like little children paid for everything we've ever done on a cross. All of our pride, all of our sin, all of the things that are leading us away from him, all of it was paid for on the cross.